Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, ESG Corporate Messaging, How to Set Yourself Up for Success. My name is Jeff Vanderby. I'm your moderator for this discussion with Natalie and Justin. But before we begin, I'd like to do a couple housekeeping items. So first, the webinar interface you see in front of you is interactive. So if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll find a Q&A option, which is where you can submit your questions to our panelists. Below that are links to our resources page, where you'll see recent ESG-related content. And if you'd like to speak to a Cision expert post-event, just type yes into the third box on the screen. On the far left-hand side of your screen, you'll also see an option to view our panelists' bios, plus links to Cision social media feeds. All of these components can be minimized at any time and adjusted as per your preference. Finally, please note at the end of the webinar, the survey will pop up. We'd very much love for you to fill out this, as your feedback is immensely important to us. All the housekeeping matters out of the way, I would like to ask our panelists to give a very brief intro of each of them. So I'll start with you, Natalie.
Hello, thank you very much for having me. My name is Natalie Kenway. I'm Global Head of ESG Insights at ESG Clarity, a global website for fund selectors around the world with an interest in responsible investment. I've been here since around 2020 and was at a website called Investment Week before that.
Thank you. And Justin?
Hi, everyone. My name is Justin Ruiss. I am the Director of IR Activations here with Cision PR Newswire. In this role, we help activate and help enable everyone to understand the IR services that we help sell here. And my background stems from sell-side equity research and primary research.
Thank you both. All right, let's start the discussion with kind of a state of where we're at. So we've obviously seen an increase in corporate communication messaging in regards to ESG and sustainability. So how would you both describe corporate messaging around ESG currently? Natalie, I'll start this with you.
Cool, thanks. Okay, well, my answer, I probably sound like I'm contradicting myself, but I think it can be quite varied. So the individual campaigns that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis, they can be quite varied. We've seen engagement reports, we've seen people talk about net zero, we've seen people talk about different themes, clean energy, water, infrastructure. I will come to mind as something that I've seen a lot of recently. But I think the underlying corporate messaging for a lot of groups is very samey, very repetitive, a bit vague as well. And lots of groups saying ESG is in our DNA, which I think is just, in my opinion, a bit of a cop-out. I think it just doesn't say enough. I think everyone thinks that they're the only person that's saying it, or the only group that's saying it. Sorry to go in on this really, really negative, but that's my sort of view on the overall corporate messaging that we're seeing at the moment.
I would like to add to that, because I think it's funny that you mentioned ESG is part of a company's DNA, but maybe there's some gene editing going on. I do think there is, like you said, Natalie, a lot of messaging that revolves around similar trends, and we've noticed it here too. A lot of sustainability reports, like you said, the hiring of certain key personnel to handle sustainability, which is great, and it's fantastic movement in the area. I think the level of depth that companies are willing to go into at this point is still a little surface level. However, there are opportunities for them to go deeper at this point. I just wonder if there needs to be more personnel or more discussions, maybe at a board level or a management level, to help really flesh out what that messaging should look like.
Yeah, I think I would agree. It seems like they're just scratching the surface, but it will take just a few companies to take that plunge and be really bold in their messaging, and then hopefully we'll see a bit more variety and some real differences in what's going on out there.
Impact investing and sustainability indexing is also on the rise, with many investors are seeking out sustainability investments to help build out ESG portfolios. how should companies think about the types of messaging that would attract the attention of investors and indexes?
Am I going first?
Totally open.
I think, yeah, the groups, they really need to think about what they are doing, what they are offering that is unique in the market, and how they're putting their ESG building blocks together, how they're doing it from an investment space, the investment perspective, how they are building their teams and how those teams are working. If they have separate ESG teams, how they're working with the broader business, or as I've understood, which I think is quite a good way of doing it, is having ESG people sit within different teams. And if they are providing real evidence of them being sustainable, that's the kind of thing I think that will attract attention. Are they showing that they are engaging? Are they showing that they are having really meaningful conversations with the regulators, the companies they're investing in, their peers, all of these things that can help move the sustainable investment movement forward. Yeah, I think those are the main things.
That's very, I think it's kind of serendipitous, because we got similar advice from clients of ours saying, if you really want to see ESG and sustainability work, it needs to be in your operations, right? And I think what you said, Natalie, about the idea of having ESG people sit within, that's a really strong message. And it's something really to hammer home, is the fact that you do need these personnel to sit in and understand what operations really look like. The best example we heard was an oil and gas company who mentioned, if we were to put out a report or any kind of quarterly filing that didn't mention safety at all for our personnel, we would look really foolish, because it's incorporated in operations. We want to keep our personnel safe. That idea, that notion, has to carry over into sustainability as it needs to be part of the operations conversation. And I think the strategy is 100% sound. You have to have those people in place to be able to understand and see where ESG can be inserted into the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to stop putting Natalie on the spot and going first, Justin, I'll let you handle this one first, and it's a multi-parter. So how are funds increasing the level of transparency for sustainability investments? Are you comfortable with the advancements they've made at this time? And then final part, how should companies view these changes on the fund level, and what is an appropriate response from companies?
Yeah, I think the amount of regulation that's coming out around transparency for investment funds, I think needs to be ramped up. There needs to be a level of clarity when it comes to ESG investing. And I think that starts with the investment funds out there, right? The asset managers, the buy side personnel of the world. The nasty term gets thrown around, greenwashing, this idea of kind of adding all of these very sustainable companies into a portfolio and really just accelerating from there. But there needs to be a level of research that has to be done from an ESG and sustainability perspective in order to understand what the fund makeup looks like. In fact, I think it's a level that goes beyond just the investment community. It has to really reach down to the retail investors too. You have a lot of people that are now into retail investing. They're doing their homework. They're doing their research. They really need to understand what they're investing in. So that level of clarity and transparency really, really needs to be ramped up. And in a lot of ways, it really needs to just be ramped up in general, not just with ESG. There needs to be, I think, a higher level of transparency. What that looks like, that might be something the regulators have to really discuss, whether it's the SEC or a different group has to get involved. But I think that level of transparency just within ESG and sustainability should help really highlight and shed a really good spotlight on the entire movement in general, not just something that looks like really good environmental, impact or a pathway to get to net zero, there needs to be a higher level of sort of understanding when it comes to sustainability. Natalie, do you have any other comments towards that?
Yeah, I agree with what you said. I think at the fund level, I think we can get fund managers getting really excited talking about how sustainable some of their holdings are, but they can be cherry picking and it's not really representative of the entire portfolio. And something I was chatting to a fund selector about was having fund managers report on how much of their portfolio is committed to net zero, which I think would be quite a good trackable metric if everyone's doing it, then we can compare apples with apples and pears with pears. But in terms of the sort of fund labeling and the regulation, it's been such an interesting year. There's been so much debate around fund labeling. The EU have come up with their own sustainable fund disclosure regulation, SFDR. Try and remember all these acronyms in this industry. And then in the UK, we've got the FCA coming up with their own version of fund labelling coming up soon. So whether these are going to be aligned, we don't know. But the SFDR has also seen lots of criticism. So will the FCA be aligning themselves with the EU version, or taking on board that criticism and taking a different route? There's a lot of debate. We don't know where we're going to be in the UK, but some clarity would be nice. And I think one of the problems with SFDR is that it's created a bit more confusion. We've got lots of groups launching into the Article 9, perceived to be the darker green category. And then we've got this Article 8 of lots of groups, lots of funds or products mentioning ESG or mentioning sustainable, but not actually that having been their full focus and objective. So it's a debate we're going to be talking about for a few more years, I think.
To follow up on that, Natalie, I wonder if this is one of those situations where maybe it's a game of chicken, where the regulators are looking at the investors saying, you really need to figure this out before we start to figure a lot of this stuff out. Here, I guess the follow-up to that is, should that onus be on the investment community?
Some of the conversations I've said, and it's probably been said a lot actually, that this is the one part of the industry where the regulator is catching up with investment demand and asset managers creating these kinds of products. Should the onus be on the investment community? I don't know. I really don't know. We look to the regulator to set parameters, don't we? We look for some guidance, and we have to do what they say eventually. And I think the FCA has consulted the industry on what might come out of these fund labels, but the industry is not agreeing with each other. So it's I'm probably confusing the matters even further in this conversation, as that's how I feel the debate is within the industry.
I should have mentioned.
I was going to say, I think you could even look to other areas where regulation needs to sort of insert itself. Like if you, and this is sort of a Wild West comparison, but if you look at something like cryptocurrency, where the regulation has really been, it's ramped up recently, but in earlier years, it was moving at a snail's pace. For ESG, which I think ESG and sustainability have way more of an impact long term, I think there needs to be more. There need to be more eyes on this from a regulatory standpoint, not just. I mean, even with the U.S. for the SEC, I think it really shouldn't just be a climate-based note that appears in an annual filing, even though that's what the proposal was.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we've seen just this week actually, groups the members of the PRI and other sort of similar initiatives have all sort of come together and said we need global harmonization in the disclosures, because we've got the ISSB coming out. They've released their first proposals. So sorry, the ISSB, for people that don't know, I'm sure everyone does, but it's the international standards that was created, it was sort of launched in COP26, and now they're sort of going about looking at how corporates will need to report on climate disclosure or sustainable disclosures. So when we're looking at TCFD, which has been rolled out in the UK and then being taken in other countries, but when different regulators, so the FCA and the EU and the SEC, are looking at their own fund labelling, are they taking on these international guidelines, frameworks as well? Because yeah, we do want to, we want to make life easier for people and make this as easy as possible to see where a company is stacking up in terms of their climate credentials. So we need it to be simple for investors for a change.
I should have mentioned at the outset for our audience that at the end of this webinar, there'll also be a quiz on all the acronyms that they hear today.
I will fail.
TLDR, I guess.
Similar to almost our conversation here, of the three letters, the E of environmental can sometimes dominate the conversation in sustainability. What other aspects do you see in social and governance that help round out or elevate a company's sustainability story? What aspect would you like to see more of? I'll start this with you, Justin.
I think on a social perspective, there are a lot of different areas, and we've seen it too, even in press material that comes out. Companies are doing a very good job of this. They're highlighting the community outreach that they do. They're highlighting the diversity and inclusion that they've achieved, right? Whether it's through reports, whether it's through messaging. They're using the wire as a means to help disclose all of this information, which is fantastic. It's great. It's great forward movement. I think there can be more that can be done on the S portion when it comes to ESG. And I think it really does highlight and elevate a company's profile within the greater space. Remember, a lot of this ends up being a competitive advantage, right, for a lot of companies. So highlighting and understanding what your internal profile looks like and being able to communicate that internally and externally is a very, very powerful message. And I think a lot of companies should take notice of this and really understand there's a lot of good leverage that you have within your own company's profile to be able to highlight all of this information. And again, like I said, I mean, it's great information that is internally focused. So all of your stakeholders internally, as well as externally focused. And it gets on the radars of particular vendors. It gets on customers' radars. It gets on the investors' radars. So I think the S portion is a really strong area to highlight. I think the board diversity and I think board makeup is another area, especially on the governance side. I don't want to take too much thunder out of this because I feel like Natalie has some answers too. But Natalie, do you want to jump in?
No, I'm nodding my head very enthusiastically because I agree. I'm agreeing with what you're saying on the social side. I don't think groups are talking about what they're doing in terms of community enough. Just as an example, we run a piece in the summer talking about some groups and some of their charity work, some of the community things that they're involved in. It did really well. It got lots of hits. Some people wanted to find out about that kind of stuff. And when we've also run something on, am I allowed to say company names? I should have asked this before. Am I allowed to mention company names? No issues there, or?
In one context, are you about to praise companies?
Yeah, I'm going to praise them.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, the Rathbones have led a modern slavery campaign and human rights campaign, which is back to lots of asset managers. So seeing asset managers come together for a cause like that is really positive, and again, well received by our readers. And also, when we run our ESG Clarity Awards, we had a social awards, and it was wow, I didn't realize all of these groups were doing all of these different things. And Alcati donates a portion of their management fees to different social projects in emerging markets. These are the things, and actually they do quite a good job of talking about that a lot. But these are the things that I know there are other asset managers doing things like that, and it's not shouted about enough. I don't think they're being shy. I'm not sure whether they think that it's something that's important, but I think that's something that investors would really, really like to see. And on the governance side, again, I think corporates maybe think that people just know that we do this anyway. That it's what we do, so we don't need to talk about it. But I think if there are groups out there doing really interesting things about diversity, about corporate culture, about how they are as an investment manager, how they're using their might and influence in terms of shareholder votes against executive pays, positions on boards, things like that. That's all really, really interesting, and they should definitely be talking about that a lot more.
The area I would also advise companies to think about is your partnerships, who you're partnered with. Those are really powerful. That's also really powerful messaging that you can take back, because if your partners are strong champions in any really part of ESG, it's a really good way to highlight that you have a commitment to this. Even from a research perspective, if you're just starting out, check out what your competitors are doing, check out what your partners are doing. Ask about these types of engagements, because I think no one at this point will be tight-lipped about what they want to do or where they've been achieving in ESG. So I think that's really a great place to start looking around and doing that initial research.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
ESG data and ratings, rankings, they've become incredibly important as benchmarks and tools for research. How do you suppose companies will use these data points to tell their sustainability stories? What data provides the best transparency at this point? I'll start this one with you, Natalie.
Yeah, I think the feeling that I've got from speaking to people in our readership, that we just need to be really careful about ratings. This is a relatively immature part of the industry. And I don't know, I don't think ratings have got a really good press from an ESG perspective at the moment. And it's, I think it is because of that. We're at a stage where we haven't got all the data, we haven't got the disclosures of it, we haven't got the data. There are some things that we need to get through to get to a point where we're at a good stage. Regulators looking at ratings. IOSCO is looking at ratings. They sort of released a report recently saying that there was a lack of transparency, there's conflicts of interest, that the data's not reliable. So there's lots of areas that need to be improved. I think it's just as with all fund research, that ratings is part of the story. So just make sure that you sort of look at it's one thing that you look at, but not the only thing. And in terms of sort of my perspective as a journalist, ratings are helpful because we can see where we look out for when there are new ratings or improved ratings. That area is moving up in terms of ESG integration. There's more of those now. So we obviously know that the equities is the sort of leader in terms of ESG integration. We've seen more fixed income funds gain ESG ratings recently. So they are good pointers for us from a journalist point of view.
Yeah, it's almost like taking a look at the upgrades and downgrades.
Yeah, it gives us a feel.
I think one of the other areas, especially with data, that you have to really examine, and I think it's a tough conversation to have because so much of the data is ubiquitous, right? It kind of really relates to everybody, but also at the same time, you do have to take it by an industry perspective. A data center's reduction in carbon emissions is probably a huge thing considering the amount of energy that they consume versus another clean tech company that's already doing wonders and is as close to net zero as possible. So I think the advancements and sort of the way that the data is presented is incredibly important for many different industries. However, it all relates back to the same thing, right? It all relates back to becoming as close to net zero as possible. And that's definitely on the environmental side. I'm sure there are other areas and other key data points that companies need to be highlighting and sort of exploring. But I think it's just important to take it at an industry level now to help understand the context of what a company really is doing, like how far and what achievements they've really come up with.
Yeah, I mean, what I should say as well is I think like the data providers are doing like obviously amazing work trying to get to the bottom of what is a confusing, and I keep saying it, but relatively immature industry, and we rely on their research and data so much. So yeah, they are doing a fantastic job. It's just the rating side of thing. I think we need to we're not quite there yet.
Natalie, do you feel that there needs to be, and I know a lot of groups have come up and we've already mentioned a lot of acronyms now, but do you think there needs to be more, I guess, coverage, or there needs to be more third party or essentially like nonprofit organizations doing their homework in these areas? Or do you think that we have sort of a very good structure now in those groups that are doing the ESG homework? They're doing the sustainability research and understanding where companies are. Where do you think that level is?
I think we need a bit of both. The non-profit stuff is interesting. They tend to expose stuff that the data providers might not want to, and that obviously provides us with stories. But I think that they do have the non-profits do have a place in contributing towards the whole industry's research, data, and messaging. We need to take it all into consideration.
I'd like to dive into a point Justin made a couple of minutes ago. So companies are setting goals to become carbon neutral within specified timeframes, and those are typically estimates that the companies make for themselves. Do you feel these timelines are helping companies keep true to their decarbonization efforts? Natalie, I'll start this one with you.
Yeah, we obviously, and lead up to COP26, we saw so many net zero announcements, we couldn't keep up with them. But I think it's been a real mixed bag of jumping on the bandwagon and companies actually genuinely doing this because they realise it's something that's completely necessary. And I think there's the groups that are taking it seriously. Like, what are we doing now? What are we doing this year? What are we doing to work towards that net zero target? And then there are groups that are like, oh yeah, let's commit to net zero 2050, 60, 70, and think about it in 10 years time. And it's interesting. Like, we obviously want to see those action steps being taken now and improvements over the short term, not be waiting for years to come and then sort of try and do lots of things really quickly. I think with what kind of thing, the G fans and the net zero, another acronym, the Glasgow, I'm not going to try and remember it, G fans and the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. That's something that the groups that sign up to that, they need to start reporting on that on an annual basis. So where on their percentage of net zero, percentage of assets under management committed to net zero. That's, I think, yeah, that's what we want to see, and that's what investors are asking about as well. They're actually asking groups if they are signed up to this initiative. So that's really interesting. That I think the pressure is on for groups to do more and more now rather than just committing to a target that's decades away.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I don't have much more to add to it. That's very succinct, Natalie.
For either of you, Do either of you foresee any major risks in disclosing sustainability-related news?
I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going to just jump in, but there's obviously this backlash recently, and there's obviously the regulator is, or various regulators are cracking down on any sort of greenwashing. So if you are sort of someone that is shouting from the treetops that you're the best at ESG, and then that comes back to bite you, then obviously that's not great. But I mean, we talked a bit about transparency. I think being open, honest, upfront, this is a journey. It's not going to be perfect. There might be things that you get wrong. Like, I think a lot of groups got caught up with the company last year that had problems with its supply chain. And yeah, I don't feel like though those positions were in most part taken on with that knowledge and just being like, let's try and hide it, or let's sort of brush it under the carpet. It was just, oh, actually, we didn't know this was going on, and this is something we will ask about in future. So I don't think it's really asking a question, but I guess there are risks. But I think transparency is key, and being open, honest, upfront, not shy away from things. We definitely don't like any no comments in our stories.
I think it's tough too, because you think about the idea of like, how do you avoid being in this situation? And I think, like you said, communication is paramount, and no comment is not really a good strategy around this. And we've even seen it with some companies who just say, we're not going to be a big player in this. At this point, I don't know if you really can afford to not be even a half-hearted player in this. So there needs to be some sort of commitment there. But I get a sense that the investment community understands, and bigger investment houses, right, bigger asset managers will understand that the amount of time that a company needs to get to a proper level of sustainability will take time. The bigger organizations out there are already, topping the charts when it comes to the ratings and rankings, right? And good on them for that. But for smaller to mid-cap size companies, it will take time. And I think there's a lot of value in being upfront with the fact that the time frame is going to be a little bit longer. At the end of the day, a company doesn't want to sacrifice margin or sacrifice profit in the face of, really, really hammering home ESG or sustainability. It's a really fine line between how much capital is devoted to growth and how much capital is devoted to sustainability. There's a proper amount for every company. That line needs to be figured out. And maybe the investment community can help educate or help really put companies in a better place of understanding where those levels need to be. So the conversation needs to happen at, the roadshow level. It has to happen at the management level. These companies need to be discussing this with their investors, whether it's large asset managers, whether it's private equity, whether, whoever it may be. But that level of education has to come from having the conversation. So if the transparency can come out of that, I think that's really great. I think for companies at this point, look to your competitors, look to who the best and the brightest are in the industry. Take everything with a grain of salt. Be as skeptical and as cautious as possible when you're reading and doing your homework. Because again, you don't want to be in the situation. I think Natalie sort of alluded to it. You don't want to be in a situation where you've been touting, we've been doing this for decades, and then it turns out, you actually weren't, net zero. You weren't at a carbon emission reduction. I mean, I just look at Volkswagen not too long ago, right? I mean, they had a very, very big emission scandal with their cars, and that really bit them. do you want to be in that situation where you can be upfront about it and you can understand and map out levels of where you need to be over the course of X amount of years? I think that's a smart strategy. Think about it from an operations perspective. How well can all of this integrate into the operations succinctly? And then how can we become this company that has sustainability written into how our profit is generated?
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think like we sort of discussed that this is a journey. There's going to be things that come up. There's going to be blips in the road. But I think coming back to like the question, the major risks, the biggest risk of all is if we don't do this, isn't it? So if the companies don't address this, they simply won't exist in years to come, I think.
Thinking of that years to come, what are your assumptions throughout 2022 and beyond for sustainability and how companies can shape the way they conduct their business?
I think the investment industry is going to step up. I feel like there's a lot of positive moving parts. We've got lots of collaboration now. We've got not so many, but we've got quite a few initiatives focused on different areas, whether it's net zero. There was a water initiative the other day. There's a lot going on with asset managers working together. I mentioned the modern slavery one as well. So I feel that there's only one way to go with this, and that's moving forward. And I feel like it's going to be a meaningful move forward in the sort of, well, I say the next year, not just in 2022, but within the next year. And I think also the regulator is rolled out TCFD on to asset managers first, because it has the might and influence of all investment, savings and pensions. It's got that opportunity to make a real impact, and for other industries to follow, to look at what we're doing and saying, we all need to be working together. We all need to be taking meaningful action about to get towards net zero. So I feel quite positive. Hopefully I won't be proved wrong.
I think when you look at the biggest players in the industry, like the BlackRocks and the Vanguards of the world, they're setting the tone, right? Which I think is incredibly important. Does all of that trickle down to the 50 billion and below hedge funds in the world? Probably not. Some I think will be a little more, maybe some will be a little more forward thinking. But it has to come from the top, right? And I think the best and brightest in the world doing their homework and pressing the, let's call it the electric gas pedal on this, I think it really helps push the medium forward. So my advice would be look to those types of institutions for what messaging comes out and what sort of strategies are put in place for this, because I think they're going to be the ones that really set a lot of the tone for what goes on. And I think Natalie mentioned the TCFD. I think they do. I think a lot of the work that the TCFD is doing really helps shed light on this as well. So I would hope that more organizations and more companies take notice of these and start to really understand, again, research, right? Do the research, but understand what the medium looks like and how to get on an investor's profile, right? How to stand out. And again, it's a competitive advantage. You want to be as robust with all of this as possible, because somebody in your industry may be doing it better. In fact, somebody just in general might be doing it better, because so many are just laser focused on ESG. It's your competitive landscape has just exploded at this point. It's so big.
I just wanted to touch on, you had made a really valid point that yes, it would be a lot easier for some of the bigger groups to take this step forward, and some of the smaller groups will find it trickier, maybe a little bit left behind. I think there's also, I should sort of highlight that, again, if we're talking about developing markets versus developed markets, we obviously is going to be easier, I think, for the developed markets companies to do that. So that's something to bear in mind. And how can we take them along with us?
Natalie, I'd like to get your perspective on a couple things. So again, sorry for a two-parter, but doubling down on a couple of things you said earlier. So for you, what are you looking for when someone reaches out and kind of pitches you their ESG story? And the second part of the question, how do you spot those people that you kind of mentioned earlier, like the check the boxers? Any common flags for people who not really seem committed to their initiatives?
Journalists love this when they're asked what do we want to see in our inbox and what don't we want to see. So yeah, I obviously get a lot of pitches. The things I'm looking out for is something fresh, whether it's a completely new conversation, adding a further layer to a conversation, moving a conversation forward. We do get a lot of, and we do say we've covered this quite a bit now. This is not anything new, so sorry, not for us. We always want someone senior to talk to us, someone senior in the business. CEOs writing comments for us always do really well. People talking about regulation. Regulation is one of our biggest hitters. SFDR, FCA, Department of Labour, SEC. They're like sort of some of our key talking points for our readership. So that's something I'll always take a look at if I see something about that. And yes, greenwashing, and more recently sort of addressing the ESG backlash. That's I guess that's sort of the conversation that's moving onwards. But yeah, and anything new to add to that would be interesting. And I guess it's back to that old sort of negativity bias. People still love bad news. But then on the other side, I think our readers and investors, they want to see groups being called out for greenwashing if they are doing so. Other things that, like pitches for interviews, we've got a really popular Green Dream video series. I mentioned before the sort of work with charities or communities. We've been running sort of personal pieces. We did a sustainable summer, so asking individuals about how they've made sure their summer's ESG friendly, and that's been really popular. So people like those. And the other question was the red flags.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
If they say ESG is in their DNA, it's a red flag to me. Because it's just, why haven't you got anything like more unique or more interesting to say that? It's sort of, and we had groups saying, oh, we've had ESG in our DNA for decades and decades, because we're always looking at the management of a company and we don't like bad management. So that's governance. So therefore we've been doing ESG for decades, and it's just not enough. Other things like sort of carrying out climate risk analysis as part of TCFD anyway, but if you ask a group about that and they don't know what you're talking about, then that's obviously a red flag. And the whole engagement with transitioning companies. So we would ask them, well, so you're engaging with this fossil fuel or this company that said they're going to do this, this, and this to be more sustainable. Have they done that? No. Have you divested? No. Well, that's obviously a huge red flag. Those are the kind of things that have been raised to us by our readers.
Yeah, I would just want to hop in because unjust transitions is something that we had brought up on a prior webinar of ours, and I think that's a very very big area to explore is the idea of these unjust transitions. So that's another key area. Thank you for bringing that up.
No worries.
We've got a ton of questions from the audience, so I actually want to start throwing some of these out there. They're great. Either of you, feel free to jump in. They're not, so far nothing's posed to one of you in particular, so whoever wants to handle it, go for it. So the first question, who normally has the ultimate responsibility for ESG at the company? And do you think there will be any emerging roles or organizational restructure as ESG becomes more scrutinized?
I mean, yeah, we sort of we've run a few pieces on the sort of emerging role Chief Sustainability Officer, and there's been lots of talk around the head of ESG. Has been sitting in the basement for 20 years, suddenly finds himself on the board, being really important because companies have realised that this is like something that needs to be done and something that needs to be talked about. Ultimately, I think it stops with the CEO. That the CEO needs to make sure that this is being addressed. Climate change is being mitigated within that business.
Do you feel that it's fair to be writing those levels of or those goals into compensation at this point? I feel like that's part of the governance area that needs to be either shed light on or something. That from an investment standpoint, I would want to know how these C-suite folks are compensated, right? If sustainability is truly at the forefront, I would hope that someone's paycheck is dependent on getting to that area.
Yeah, I think it's hugely important. We have seen elements of that as well, and linked to diversity. Yeah, I agree with you. I'd want to see that in companies that I invest in. So, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I was getting some feedback back there for a second. Next question. Beyond standards and measurement, as ESG becomes just another business function, what's the proactive value of PR and marketing? And when does sameness mean impact only investors, businesses have anything of value to say on sustainability?
I was going to let you take this one. I'm not sure that I understand the question, to be honest.
I guess when it comes to being the proactive side of PR and marketing on this area, I think you have to be as transparent as possible when it comes to ESG and sustainability. And I think while we have seen many trends emerge, I think companies can't be or can't afford to not be at least meeting the minimum requirements at this point for disclosing ESG and sustainability. So many companies have sustainability reports. How many of them are actually utilizing a marketing service or using anything like a wire product or anything like that to really highlight and accentuate that area? Is your website dedicated to or has a dedicated portion to sustainability? That's another really great area to just be as forward and focused with your internal and external stakeholders. So much of it may look like, I know that they use the term sameness, but so much of it can look like that. But if you're not playing ball, if you're not even in the game at this point, what kind of messaging can you exactly set apart from the rest of the pack? You have a sustainability report, highlight it. You have great data or you have great metrics that already showcase how well you're highlighting ESG. Disclose it. Be as transparent as possible in these areas. And yes, if you do have news that you can share, albeit the hiring of a sustainability officer, the partnerships that you agree to, the outreach that you're doing, be forward with it. It resonates.
Yeah, I think I would just sort of come back to the sort of point we made on social and what companies are doing on the social side within communities and charities. That's not something that groups are talking about as much, but it's something that our readers, seem to be interested in. So that's a good starting point.
I think the thing to also remember with ESG, as opposed to very many different areas of PR and IR, is ESG hits a very large stakeholder group. It's not just your shareholders, it's not just your clients, it's not just your employees. So even thinking about messaging from that perspective, you are hitting a group. You are reaching out and hitting a stakeholder group and educating them on what your advancements are. So I think even if you have news to share, it is very forward. And while maybe a partnership agreement isn't as strong with your employees, it may be very impactful for your clients. It may be very impactful for your investors. So think of it from the perspective of, okay, there's a large stakeholder group. We're going to be messaging this towards everyone. Where will this resonate best?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Next question. Touching on the role of nonprofits, do you think more corporates will move towards a B Corp social enterprise model as a way to truly ensure ESG is a part of their DNA and avoid any accusations of greenwashing, etc.?
I hope so. We've been doing a series with big corp companies recently, and I understand a bit more about the process companies have to go through to get that certification, and it is a rigorous process. So it would be good to see more companies sign up to that and have a big focus on, as well as like how they're governing themselves internally. There's a B Corp financial coalition at the moment looking at the governance and corporate culture within the investment management industry. So I think these are all positives. The more groups that sign up, the better.
I agree. I don't have much more to add, but I agree.
Cool. Next question. Is it a negative if a company does not set a net zero goal?
I wonder, this is a very good question. I don't know. Again, this is context of like, well, what sort of industry are you in? Or what is your time frame for achieving it realistically? Because again, I point back to the data centers of the world, right? Energy consumers, gigantic offenders, right? It's part of their DNA. It's part of the model of how their business is structured, and getting to a net zero area is probably going to take a long time. Even though data centers are very profitable, they're a great, it's a great business model. So looking at that sort of, or looking at it from an industry by industry perspective, you have to sit and understand and wonder where can you, or how can you really achieve net zero, and what does your time frame look like? Because even if it is a very difficult task to do, and it may take decades, having significant reduction, like 10, 20% in carbon emissions, is still very impactful. Getting to zero is not, the other thing to note here too is getting to zero is not an easy task. It's on paper, it sounds great, but actually achieving that it's an arduous goal. So even for whatever industry, if you're making shoes or if you're making apparel, it's still an arduous goal. It's still resourcing, it's still supplying, there's still a lot to it. So not setting a zero goal is one thing, but educating on the time frame, I think, is another. Natalie, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, that was such a good answer. It was a great question, a great answer. There's no point setting a net zero goal if you can't commit to it, is there? So I don't think not having a net zero commitment is a deal breaker, but there needs to be, like you said, a reason why. It's got to be the context of why do you not think you can do that at the moment? But yeah, ultimately everyone should be thinking about it and how they're going to do it.
Yeah, there's a ton of really good questions. So next one, what do you think is the impact of ESG information in terms of employee communications? What are the critical things to share with them? Justin, if you want to maybe take the lead on that one.
I think, man, that's a really good question. I think having strong messaging, and again, this comes back to the idea of that internal stakeholder and communicating with the internal stakeholder. I think being transparent with your with your employee group is incredibly impactful and builds a lot of credibility and legitimacy within your organization. I think employees want to see this. They want to be a part of, Natalie said it best, it's a journey. You want to be part of it, right? You want to be suited up and ready to go with the company. Critical aspects to share. I think one of the areas or how you do this is very important, because it needs to be, or whatever messaging it may be, it needs to be targeted to particular groups within the company. If you have really strong diversity and inclusion messaging, or you're really ramping up in that area, it's very powerful to bring in the leaders from those areas that will help tell the story, like a human resources department, something along those lines. So share the knowledge with the departments that will best be able to use it. Give everyone the best equipment to use and go forward with. I think that's one of the things I would say, just on a how-to basis. But Natalie, if you have any other information to share, that'd be great.
Not really on the how-to, but why I think it's important, not just for employees, but potential future employees as well. We've done a few surveys on that we know millennials are really aware of climate change, and this is something they are looking at when they're considering future employers. This is something they want to know, whether that employer is doing everything they can to mitigate their impacts. And I think it was Bupa that did a survey recently that millennials and that sort of the generations around the millennials, climate change is affecting their mental health. They are carrying the weight of that on their shoulders. They are worried about the future. So for companies to consider that when they are in recruitment, or in their messaging to their employees and future employees, is really, really important.
It's a badge of honor, right? It's a pride point.
All right, we're getting close on time, so obviously it's a longer question, but whatever you can get in a couple of minutes as an answer would be great. For companies who are already doing well on net zero and supply chain by virtue of their core business operations, and therefore think they are doing enough, how would you convince their management that more needs to be done regarding social and governance issues, especially when it's very hard to measure the impact of S&G?
Natalie, how well can companies still do when it actually is in their DNA?
So convincing companies that they need to do more on S&G when they're already doing well on the E, right? I think we can come back to the just transition point, making sure that that moving into a sustainable world also provides equal opportunities for all. So that comes under the social element, and also, are we doing it in an environment that people want to work in terms of looking at corporate culture and in a diverse work team force? I'm a bit stuck on this one, but I think that there are lots of valid points. Maybe we're coming to the end of the conversation, but there are plenty of reasons. The just transition and to making sure that the equal opportunities for all within the workforce, within societies, taking them all along this journey on climate with us is a really, really important point.
I think Natalie, to your point about just transition, I think one of the key areas to highlight within that, as a company does incredibly well in these key areas, is the fact that nothing was sacrificed, right? You're moving forward. Your operations are moving forward in an incredible pace. You're crushing it. You're doing everything you can to really provide on an ESG level and from a profitability standpoint, and you sacrifice nothing to get there. I think that's really important. And when you have a really good story around that, and you can energize a workforce, or you can highlight the differences that you have, all of it stems down to another key component of this. You have a competitive advantage, and you've sacrificed nothing to get there. I think that's a really good message to deliver to your board, to your management team, to say there's more to this than just, having a very nice report card. I think there's an intangible.
Absolutely.
Very nice closing sentiment, Justin. We've got 10 seconds left, so I want to make sure I just got a chance to thank everyone of our attendees for the awesome questions. We will follow up with answers to more of them, so thank you very much. We really enjoyed today's session. Please watch out for email follow-ups to the rest of them. We'll get Natalie and Justin to weigh in. So thank you all, and thank you very much to my presenters here. No needing to prompt that anyone was still on mute.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.